A peasant wakes up to the rooster's call, as he has done every day. It's 5 a.m. and it's time to be working the fields, doing his chores. As he makes his way towards the fields, his knees ache and his back cracks into place. It's truly back-breaking work being a peasant labourer, now more so than ever. The peasant, however, is one of the lucky ones. He has survived the Black Death that saw 1/3 of the population of England die. His workload therefore has doubled, but his pay has stayed the same, just like it is for all of his fellow peasant farmers. But what other choice do they have? They were born low on a rigid feudal system, and people need to eat. After years of the same routine, the peasant's body finally gives out, literally worked down to the bone. So malnourished and overworked is he that his body gives out, and simply he does not wake up the next morning. The fellow peasant labourers notice the peasant's absent and march towards his small shack on the farm, seeing that he has died, and even with their supervisor's whip at their backs, forcing them to get back to work, they down their tools in fury and frustration. The peasants have had enough, and it's time to revolt. Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm the Knight of History, and this is part number 2 of a 5-part series where we're focusing on the late medieval period in England. This week we're going to focus on the Peasants revolt, of course. But while I have you here, I'm thinking of starting a donors wall of fame, which will probably be done through a Cash App or PayPal or something like that. However, the benefits to these donations will be used for charitable purposes. I'm involved in a whole bunch of charities around the world, and I would really be interested if you would let me know if you would be interested in donating and thinking if this is a good idea or not. Comment down below. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. By 1351, the very worst bits of the Black Death were over in England, and by many estimates, because they didn't really keep good records on death back then, around 2 million people had died. That's around 1/3 of the English population. Having lost such an enormous proportion of the country's population, landowners found it really difficult to find enough peasants to work their land, work their farms. And the peasants, on the other hand, knew that their services were now in high demand. I mean, it's not like the wealthy nobles and the wealthy landowners were about to go and work the fields. So the peasants started to move from farm to farm, asking for higher wages. The King of England at the time, Edward III, tried to stop this from happening in 1351 with the Statute of Labourers, a law which fixed peasants' wages back to the pre-Black Death levels. In other words, you would earn the same amount before the bubonic plague. The only problem with this was that the peasants didn't really listen to their king, and the landowners paid little attention to the law, and they were trying to find a solution of their own. This is where we see a few lucky peasants with some money to spare actually purchasing land and empty houses which had previously belonged to plague victims, often at rock bottom prices because people were desperate for money. The entire economy had gone into a recession. The new class of people, the new class of landowners, became known as yeomen, meaning peasants with up to 100 acres of farmland. Very, very big farms in today's standards. Yeoman farmers threatened the feudal hierarchy and the status of the traditional landlords and nobles. Some survivors of the plague even turned against the Catholic Church, which had been rendered powerless due to them not being able to explain or prevent the Black Death. Things were changing. Power, therefore, was slowly moving towards the people, and peasants were getting more powerful. Of course, the nobility were not happy about this at all, and they forced through a law in 1363, known as the Sumpterry Law, in Parliament. And it laid out exact details of what people could wear in different class systems so they could be distinguished easier. Gold and purple silk were reserved for royalty. Lords could wear fur and precious stones. Knight could wear fur-trimmed cloaks. And finally, the peasants could only wear cloth that was less than 12 pence length. You may be a yeoman richer than a knight, but you would be forced to wear cloth. Now, of course, this isn't a really big problem, but the fact that they forced them to do it just because of their class, it was a problem indeed. This whole situation of the conflict of different classes grew with tension between lords and the people, and it came to a head in 1381. By this time, the King of England was a person called Richard II, a 14-year-old boy, and he left most of the running of his country to his uncle John of Gaunt, who was a deeply unpopular nobleman, and he really didn't care about the common people. At this time, the 100 Years' War, a war that lasted 116 years, was being fought between England and France. And to help pay for this enormous war, John of Gaunt established a poll tax, which meant that every single person had to pay 4 pence to the government for this war if they were over the age of 14. Every single person, rich or poor, had to pay 4 pence. The poll tax was naturally deeply unpopular amongst the majority of the population, the poor peasantry. Whilst royal officials arrived in the Essex town of Brentwood on the 30th of May 1381, the official clerks set up shop and began to order peasants to pay the tax. With hardly enough money to pay for their own food, the peasants refused. When the clerks set their guards on the peasants, they began to fight back. One peasant reaches for a stone on the ground and hurls it towards a guard, and with a clunk hits him in the head. The guard falls to the floor. A crowd had begun to gather at this point, and the guards began to panic and drew their swords. The peasant crowd rushes forward and topples over the clerk's desk, overpowering the guards with their numerical superiority, killing the guards and killing the officials, sending their lifeless bodies back to London. Within 3 days, the entire county of Essex is in open rebellion against the king, and a small crowd of peasants had swelled their ranks to thousands. When they walk, the ground shakes, and they will be heard. "To London!" they shout in a rage. Whilst all of this was happening, a yeoman named Wat Tyler had organised 4,000 peasants to do the exact same thing and march from their county in Kent to London City. But this was no peaceful march. The peasants wanted to be heard. They were ready for a fight. They arrived in London on the 13th of June 1381, armed with bows, clubs and axes. They even had a member of the clergy, a radical preacher called John Bull, who made these amazing speeches asking them, when Adam delivered and Eve span, who was the gentleman? In other words, we are all born as equals. Who gives the right to the nobility to rule and the peasants to suffer? Once inside London, they stormed Newgate and Westminster prisons. They took to looting John of Gaunt, the king's uncle's sumptuous home, known as the Savoy Palace, and then they burnt this palace to the ground. Another unpopular member of the government, an Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, was dragged out of his Palace of Westminster and executed in the Tower Hill alongside the Lord Treasurer Sir Robert Hales. Their heads were then placed on spikes and paraded around London. The revolt was active. The King of England, Richard II, the 14-year-old boy, had to do something about this to end the chaos, and he agreed to meet the rebels outside of London in a place called Smithfield on Saturday, the 15th of June, 1381. The rebel leader, Wat Tyler, rode out to negotiate with the king, and this is where things get a little bit hazy, especially because they didn't really keep good records back then. Some say that Tyler attacked Richard's men. Others say that Tyler rudely spat on the ground next to the king. Either way, a struggle ensued, which ended Tyler's life as he was stabbed through and through with a sword, killing him. King Richard seized the initiative and promised to agree to the peasants' demands so long as they would return to their towns and villages, which they actually did. But the king straight up lied to them and didn't keep their promises. Richard went back on every single concession that he made to the rebels. Furthermore, he had each of their top 200 leaders tracked down and hanged to prove his strength. The peasants' revolt was therefore a failure. Or was it? Well, feudal England had been challenged for the first time ever. The peasants realized if they stood together, they could put one on the man. They realized that there was no need to bend to the will of those born with a silver spoon in their hand. Over the next 2 centuries, England peasants became freemen and were no longer serfs that were sworn to work the land of their feudal lords. This is the real start of a democratic monarchy, which would be used by kingdoms around the world, many of whom look to England to see how a constitutional monarchy is done. But before England becomes this beaming democratic monarchical success, there was so much more blood that needed to be spilt in the Wars of the Roses, when two English houses of royalty took to fighting to gain the top spot in the country. But find out what happens in that episode next time. I really hope that you enjoyed that. Please like, comment, and subscribe. The more you know.